Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. My name is Pascal Lotta, and I am joined again today by Professor Dr. Yakov Rabkin, a Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Montreal, a scholar of the Montreal Centre for International Studies, and the founding member of Canada's Independent Jewish Voices. He's the author, most recently, of Israel and Palestine and Zionism Decoded in 101 Quotes. Yakov, welcome back.
Thank you.
Yakov, you recently wrote this article here that we actually published on my Substack. It is called Israel, a Danger to Jews and Non-Jews Alike. And you were writing in this piece about the synagogue that was destroyed on Passover by Israel in Tehran. Can you unpack maybe first a little bit this incident, what exactly happened, and then talk to us about what you think, what this means concerning Israel and the Jews worldwide?
Well, the episode itself is apparently a rocket that fell on a synagogue in Tehran and destroyed it. It destroyed many of the holy books as well. I don't know if it was targeted on purpose or whether it was collateral damage, but there is tremendous symbolism in that. Here it is, a state that claims to be a Jewish state, destroys the holiest kind of Jewish place, if you like, synagogue and books and scrolls and so on. So that's why I wrote it, because I'd been to this synagogue. I was in Iran about 10 years ago. And I visited Jews, and I even wrote up a little travelogue about it, so I can put it in your description if you like. The Jews in Iran that I met were living really full Jewish life, being all the while full Iranian citizens. Because I think it's very important to understand that the view of the Jews as alien, which was common in Europe and may still be common in parts of Europe till today, is not something that Jews experienced elsewhere. And we tend to project this European image of Jews on Jews elsewhere. And I think in the countries of Islam, without idealizing them, life was a lot more harmonious and peaceful. And in the case of Jews in Iran, they have been there for 25 centuries. So they saw the arrival of Islam, they saw all kinds of things. And they feel and they're perceived as Iranians, not as an alien group. And here comes a difference, that for Israel, every Jew is a potential citizen of Israel, because according to the Israeli ideology, the only safe place for a Jew to be is Israel. And Jews don't belong anywhere, because sooner or later they will be persecuted, murdered, discriminated. Anti-Semitism is eternal, and therefore the only solution to the Jewish question, the Judenfrage of Theodor Herzl, was to concentrate Jews in one ethnic state, nation state, and then Jews will be happy ever after. Well, this is the scenario that many Jews didn't accept. It was a East European scenario, to be more exact, rooted in the ethnic nationalism of Eastern and Central Europe, and was totally alien to Jews elsewhere. You know, Avi Schleim, a colleague of mine from Oxford University, wrote a wonderful memoir recently, and he mentions that he asked his mother what was Zionism when he was a kid, and she said, "Oh, it's an Ashkenazi thing. It's not our thing."
Mm-hmm.
Something
Ashkenazi.
Ashkenazi for European Jews. It's not us. And indeed, I think in the 30s, Jews from the countries of Islam constituted less than 0.5% of the delegates to the Zionist Congress. So we're talking about a European phenomenon that is alien to Jews elsewhere. And so that's to a long answer to your question. The symbolism of striking a synagogue in Iran, for me, was too great not to write this article.
So, I mean, it's a very good thing that you point out. It can be either on purpose, it can be an accident. The one thing it is probably not, I saw some tweets online that said, oh, this was the Iranians that blew it up as a false flag, but that itself makes absolutely no sense, again, because as you said, they're fully integrated, and actually the Jews of Iran condemned the attacks of Israel against their state. Right. So I think it is very important to just understand how Judaism in Iran functions. And when you were there, I mean, do you have some more observations about how this faith is one of others inside the Iranian state?
Well, the Islamic Republic relates to religion seriously, not surprisingly. Therefore, they treat religious minorities also with respect. Zoroastrian, the old religion of Iran, and Jews. Now, what does it mean in practice? When I arrived in Tehran, I walked to several synagogues, and after visiting Europe, what struck me is that there were no guards, no police cars in front of synagogues, because there was no need for that. In fact, in one case, there was an old age home and a kosher restaurant, and you could drive in a truck there. I mean, it was just perfectly open, normal. That's what what struck me. And another aspect of it is that the Islamic Republic imposed religious education on all students, on all school children. As a result, young Jewish school children have been sent to rabbis to study for 10 years. The level of Jewish literacy and observance of commandments certainly was a lot higher, is a lot higher today than it was before the Islamic Republic.
Wow.
Well, and another thing, I was there during the holidays and there was Shabbat. And of course, I was invited to the table, and there was alcohol as usual in Jewish homes on Shabbat. And I asked, well, is it legal to have alcohol? He says, yes, as Jews, we are allowed to have alcohol, and there's no problem.
I have this anecdote because I have a close Iranian friend here, and he brought me wine from Azerbaijan, but he's from the Azeri part in the north, from Tabriz. And he brought me wine and said, we make the same wine near our city. And I said, like, oh, really? But yeah, again, I was also bewildered because isn't it a Muslim country? Isn't it supposed to be forbidden? And then he looked at me and said, but look, Pascal, Islam, wine making is much older than Islam. So it was there way before Islam, and Islam is just the one of the newest things, and they didn't stop that at all. I mean, they didn't. They wanted it down, but winemaking is still part of it. So Iran, in a sense, the image that we are fed over here in the West about Iran being a place where every woman walks around in a big black carpet and whatnot is just utterly ridiculous, isn't it?
Well, when I was there, when I saw, indeed, most women, I think practically everyone, was covered, when the head was covered. But the word covered covers a whole gamut of devices on the head, from really, indeed, a black chador, very serious, to kind of I would say, a rope, something almost invisible that is on the head. And moreover, I remember on my first Shabbat in Tehran, I walked through a park, and I saw couples, and they behaved like couples behave anywhere else. So I didn't see anything particular there. Of course, there was this insistence on covering the hair and not drinking alcohol and all that. But in a way, it reminded me Soviet Union under Brezhnev, when there was official ideology and it was paid tribute to, and there was reality, and the two didn't quite coincide.
And maybe let's go back a bit to this issue of how Israel tries to portray itself as the only safe place for Jews, and actually Israel as the country of the Jews. And our colleague Jeffrey Sachs kept saying several times that he gets mad. He says, like, no, Netanyahu is not my president. Just because I'm a Jew doesn't mean that he represents me at all. When it comes to the Jews in West Asia, in Persia, in Iran, can you talk to us a little bit about the impact of Zionism, and Israel on the lives of Jews in those different communities in Tehran, in Baghdad, and so on? I know Avi Shlaim also wrote about that very famously. But can you tell us a little bit what the impact was of Zionism on these local communities there?
Well, as I said, Arab Jews or Arab or Jews from lands of Islam had not played any important role in the emergence and the development of either Zionism or Zionist settlement in Palestine. However, when the state was unilaterally declared in May 1948, Jews were associated by some leaders with Israel, particularly because Israel itself was saying that it is a state of all the Jews in the world. So there was some tension. In the case of Iraq, there had also been violence in 1941 against Jews. So there was a certain background, unrelated, as far as I know, to Zionism. But what happened after 1948, for example, in the case of Iraq, Israeli government negotiated a deal with the Iraqi government that would allow Jews to leave. But Jews were in no rush to leave. See, this is very important because Jews had lived there for centuries, and like Avi Shlaim shows, well, they were settled, they spoke Arabic, they were Arabs for all practical purposes with a different confession. So Zionist activists had to do something to prod them to leave. And here we come to a very sad episode, sad page of the history of Zionism, when Zionist activists actually committed acts of violence against Jews and against Jewish institutions in order to prod them to leave. There was explosion in Jewish institutions in Iraq. There were similar events in Egypt. In Morocco, Zionist activists frightened Jewish girls and the Zionist activists actually told me, one of them told me this whole story, and that may be worth telling you, that they would dress like Muslims, taken to another town in Morocco where no one knew them, and they would harass Jewish girls in order to frighten their parents. The worst things that can happen is that a girl would be molested. And that really moved quite a few people out of Morocco to Israel or somewhere else. And many years later, after I heard the story, I met a Moroccan Jewish woman who actually confirmed that she was on the receiving end of it in her town. And she said, no, there was a very strange episode where some Arabs attacked us, but they really didn't beat us up very well. They were just yelling and screaming more than anything else. But it was enough to frighten her parents. I mean, that was bad enough. And that's again, it's understandable, but because for the Zionist movement, for Ben-Gurion, for those who created the state, the most important thing was the raison d'etat, Staatsräson. And that's how they behaved during the Nazi genocide. Famously or infamously, Ben-Gurion is quoted as saying that he would rather save half of the children, Jewish children that could be sent to Palestine, rather than all of them if they are sent somewhere else. So for them, Jews were a human material, and human material, European human material, was exhausted because of the genocide, and that's why they had to resort to human material from from Arab countries, from Iran, and so on. So for them, Jews are a means to create a state, to strengthen the state. The state is a lot more important than individual.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. This is something that is, I think, very fundamental about the entire political movement, and we need to point that out when we talk about Zionism. I've learned that from you. What we're talking about is a political movement, the movement that wants to create Israel as the home of the Jews, by the Jews, and Jewish state. And that's the whole goal. Now, when you create something like that, what you need in modern parlance would be, of course, users, right? Any kind of big app that wants to be important needs users, and Israel needed users. It needed takers, and it could only take from a very confined pool of Jews available worldwide, right? So these incidences that you're describing is Jewish terrorism against other Jews in certain places, especially in the Arabic world, in order to increase the number of users of Israel, isn't it?
Well, I wouldn't call them users. I would say them subjects, but
Yeah.
a matter of terminology.
Do we have other instances where Zionism was directly involved with, riding the wave of what in Europe, of course, is a very old and very, very nasty tradition, the pogroms, right? Pogroms against Jews, and those were real for hundreds of years in Prague and so on. Sporadically, you would have the Christian majority trying to throw out these Jewish communities with really horrible methods, right? Do we have instances where the Zionists used such stereotypes in order to convince other Jews around the world to actually flock and settle in Palestine?
Yes, indeed. I would say that the word pogrom is a Russian word that really applies to areas that today we call Ukraine, Moldova, Baltic republics, but that's where the real violence, pogrom violence, was against Jews. Again, in Central Europe, in Western Europe, there were expulsions, there were mass murders, so blood libels, all kinds of things. Again, it was not entirely Black history. There were episodes of violence, but it's totally wrong to present history of Jews, even in Europe, as a lacrimonious history, as someone put it. So yes, there was violence, and the pogroms became better known because they were happening at the turn of the 20th century, when many Europeans believed that they had become enlightened, and all of a sudden they see that these things have happened. How is this history presented today in most Israeli schools and most Zionist schools elsewhere? As I said, this history is presented as an uninterrupted chain of abuses, murders, expulsions. In other words, Jews were always maltreated. And anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews, I'm not going to go into the difference between the two, is eternal, and it's impossible to uproot. These are the cardinal articles of faith for the Zionist. Anti-Semitism is eternal, it's impossible to uproot, and therefore the only solution is for all the Jews to live in their own state, which is not very different from ethnic nationalism in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So indeed, it comes from the same root. And that's why you had fascist regimes between the wars in practically all of the ethnic national states created after the Versailles Treaty. Baltic republics, Poland, Hungary, they all ended up having fascist regimes well before the Nazis.
The big difference with the Zionist project, though, is that Zionism is also inherently settler colonial, right? It wants to implant itself in a place and dominate that place, which does have another population there, or had another population there before. In how far does this aspect of, this being, I must maybe precise that, like, there were always Jews in Palestine. We know that. And some of them are actually still there, and they are anti-Zionist. But because they don't identify themselves with the Ashkenazis, they have also a difficult relationship. But
they may be themselves Ashkenazi, but they don't identify with Zionists.
Can you unpack that one a little bit, and this aspect of the settler colonial nature of the Zionist project?
Well, originally the Zionist project was one of creating a state for the Jews, not Jewish state. My Judenstaat, the work by Herzl, is state for the Jews.
Yes.
So these were utterly secular, many of them socialist Jews who abandoned religion and who decided to create a new Hebrew. They wouldn't even use the word Jew, a new Hebrew in a new land, which would be full of justice, harmony, and peace. And they created settler colonies in Palestine. Many of them were kibbutz, where indeed there was justice and equality, no private property. So they were creating a new society. They were educating a new Hebrew man, intrepid, courageous, daring, the very opposite of this anti-Semitic stereotype of the Jew. In the book that you mentioned, the 101 quotes about Zionism, I quote Jabotinsky, one of the ideologues of Zionism. And he said, in order to understand what kind of a new Hebrew we want, we have to look at the Yid, he uses this word in Russian, Zhid, and create someone diametrically opposed. So here is a very important point. Whereas nationalism of Poles or Ukrainians or Lithuanians strove to preserve cultural heritage and preserve the language, the Zionists wanted to get away from Jewish continuity. They were operating a revolution. They disdained their mother's tongue, Yiddish, and they created a new vernacular, modern Hebrew. So it was a revolutionary project, definitely different from those of Eastern European national states. And since they were doing it in a country that was already populated, that created tension. And for some of these early Zionist settlers, it was a difficult problem to resolve. How do they reconcile their colonial state, so to speak, with their ideals of justice and equality?
But they understood that, right? I mean, you also in your book, you have quotes of, I forgot who it was, not Herzl, and somebody after him, who said, like, well, we must understand why the Arabs in Palestine do not receive us with open arms.
Yeah, well, it was quite clear. And actually, the early Zionist settlers were quite open about it. They knew that there has to be a preponderant military force to terrorize the locals so that they will never rise against us. And that's the policy that Israel pursues to this day, to terrorize local population, neighboring states, so that they would not rise against us.
And this then has to do, with this new type of Jew that apparently the good part of the Zionist movement wanted to create. You also used the German word, the Muskeljude, or and the muscle Jew, right, to explain what type of very macho and militarized Jewish identity that these people were striving for, which in my view then links directly into the IDF. But what is it that the early Zionists thought why violence was just a necessary part of the project?
Well, I think part of the reason are the pogroms, that they experienced violence themselves, or around them there was violence, and they thought that that's how it should be done. And moreover, they saw themselves as part of the colonial movement, which in the beginning of the 20th century was perfectly acceptable in Europe.
Right.
So for them, the opinion of local population really didn't matter that much. So they essentially created a separate society, but they developed a separate society from locals. But they also had sort of a vision of a state. And that's why the Zionist leaders rejected the British idea of convening a representative assembly in 1930s as a way of preparing Palestine for independence. Because normal scenario would be to create this kind of pseudo parliament, and then that parliament would take over from the British.
Yep.
Well, that didn't happen. So I think that the living by the sword is something that is part of Zionist ideology and a part of colonial experience anywhere. Look, we don't know any settler colony which developed in peace, be it Argentina, United States, Australia. It doesn't matter really. It always resulted in violence. And Israeli historians are very open about it. They say that's the predicament. And Hannah Arendt, whom I quote in my book in 1948, during the war that Israel waged against its neighbors, she said that it doesn't matter how far the borders of Israel will be extended and how many citizens Israel will have, it will always face hostility from the population of that they displaced, that they expelled, and so on. And it's very important to realize that it's not something unusual. It's nothing to do with the clash of civilizations or the eternal hatred of the Jew. I think if Palestine had been colonized by the Swiss, there would be tremendous anti-Swiss feeling in Palestine.
But an inherent part of the entire project is, of course, the claim that it's not a settler colony, that the Jews are the original heirs of the land. It is the Arabs that are the unwelcome intruders that took over way after the Jews were actually given the land, right? So probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but a diehard Zionist will get angry at me if I claim that they are a settler colonial state, right? They will say like, no, we are the locals, they are the intruders, right?
Well, it's a matter of terminology. The largest bank in Israel, Bank Leumi, was founded in the early 20th century under the name of Jewish Colonial Trust.
Right.
I just wonder why.
No, I mean, the question that I have in my mind is how that Zionism is a huge problem, and that brings with it a lot of violence, and that is the spring of violence is for me at this point quite clear. But how to induce a a change of thought of Zionists in order to get to a place where the violence goes away, and where Zionism opens up to something that can reconcile into society, into the larger regional society. Do you think anything like that is thinkable, possible? Not from today to tomorrow, but over the next 30, 40 years.
Well, this was the vision of quite a few German Zionists in Palestine, including Martin Buber, including Einstein, who wasn't in Palestine, but who was sympathetic to this idea. They thought that Palestine should be open for Jewish settlement without, however, displacing local population and living in peace with them. So there are many organizations of that sort that were created before 1948. Of course, they withered afterwards. But I think that, and I wrote about it in 2002, so I have to own up to it. I think the only way to bring about peace and end of violence is do what Jews do everywhere else, namely they live as a minority in different countries. And the place between the Mediterranean and the River Jordan has pretty much equal numbers of Jews and Palestinian Arabs and others. So if there is equality, political equality, civil rights given to everyone, with certain measures of economic compensation and so on, I think things could be worked out. They cannot be worked out if the idea is to expel everyone, to kill, like in Gaza, genocide in Gaza, and the slow but pretty active expulsion of Palestinian Arabs from the West Bank. There's harassment, there are murders every day.
And southern Lebanon in general. I mean, everything surrounding Israel is basically a constant threat of being bombed by Israel, and new security parameters extended, right? What we've seen in Syria, in the Golan Heights. This is just constantly this constant drive to have more and then protect more and create more and then protect what you have more. That this expansionary impulse is part and parcel of how Zionism has been working for the last 100 years, right?
Well, there is one important element in all that most Israelis believe that all these acts are acts of self-defense.
Right.
And moreover, because of this ideology of being the eternal victim, they think the Palestinians are today's reincarnation of the Nazis.
Yes.
And you heard it very openly.
Yeah.
And therefore it gives them tremendous, how would I put it, tremendous force to do the horrible things they've been doing, all the while considering themselves to be victims.
Yeah.
This is the most interesting part of it. It's tremendous self-righteousness, daring, and habitual weaponization of the memory of anti-Jewish violence, be it in Europe. So, for example, I follow what happens in Israel, among other things, by looking at Israel National News, which is the site of the settlers. There you get the real thing, the real thinking of people who are the vanguard of Israel today. They are.
Do they converse in English or in Hebrew?
Oh, you can do it in English, in Russian, and Hebrew. Maybe they may have it in French as well. So just put it, I'm doing a commercial for them, israelnationalnews.com. And you would see how self-righteous they are, how convinced they are in the justice of their cause, that there is no right that anyone would have to criticize Israel. Look how one of Israeli ministers now abused Chancellor Merz for timidly criticizing Israel. Well, so you have to read these kind of people. You have to know what they are thinking, because they are the motive force of Israel. At the time when the eloquent and elegant Abba Eban, the foreign minister of Israel, would produce wonderful speeches at the United Nations, is over. And now they speak very rough language, the language of force, the language of dominance. So you don't have to uncover anything. It's in your face.
Yeah. But I wonder what that is, because for the longest time, this type of brute force, of the violent nature of Israel was actually quite well hidden. I mean, internationally, right? Just a mother of two somewhere in rural Japan, a father of three somewhere in the mountains of Switzerland. They would have an image of Israel as maybe the way it was portrayed in that Hollywood movie.
Exodus.
No, I'm sorry, not Exodus. The other one about the German guy who saved many Jews.
Oh,
Um,
Schindler's.
Schindler's List. Schindler's List is shot in black and white, and it of course depicts the horrible suffering of the Jews during the Holocaust and how this man saved a couple of them. And at the end of the movie turns into color, and it's set in Israel, right, where they then remember the dead, and Israel being like the land that's now going to save the Jews once and for all. And a lot of people have that image, but the underlying violence is, of course, then that was needed in order to do that is all completely hidden, and it has been hidden for a long time, and now it's coming to the fore. And this is where it connects to the blowing up Israel blowing up a synagogue in Tehran. It's like it's becoming obvious that this violence is part and parcel of the Zionist project, and it's also violence against Jews. It's violence against anyone who's not online with the political project, and that's kind of something new, isn't it? That it's so obvious now.
Well, it's obvious for scholars, intellectuals, and people who studied it. And I think that one of the reasons that Benjamin Netanyahu started the war when he did 40 something days ago is that he felt that the ice under his feet is melting.
Right.
Support for Israel is melting in the United States. Today the majority of Americans sort of are pro-Palestinian, not pro-Israeli. That's unprecedented, and that has been the case in Europe for a long time. It is not being translated into policies of the government. Well, this has something to do with peculiarity of democracy. But what we do see is that Israel is losing support. The fact that recently a member of Polish parliament produced an Israeli flag with a swastika in the middle instead of the Star of David is telling you about the breaking of consensus concerning Israel.
Right.
So the propaganda can work only so much. Of course, it's still there. Of course, I think a study was done of BBC coverage of violence between Israelis and Palestinians, and one Palestinian death is worth 34 times less than one Israeli death in terms of coverage by BBC per capita.
Horrible.
But this has to do with the old, I would say, venerable European tradition of white racism. So it has to do with that. And, recently, General Assembly of the United Nations adopted a resolution about reparation for slavery. And 3 countries voted against it: the United States, Israel, and Argentina. And the European Union abstained.
Yeah, everybody, including Switzerland.
So, and Switzerland, I didn't know, but even though, as far as I remember, Switzerland didn't have any colonies or slavery for that matter.
Uh, yes and no, not their own, but they piggybacked on everybody else. Wherever you had European colonizers, you had the Swiss who did the trades that the primary colonizer didn't want to do. They picked up the crumbs. Piggyback colonism.
I see. So there is a movement of rehabilitation of colonialism.
Yeah.
Seriously, there are signs of it. And the fact that the United States accepted a few thousand refugees, political refugees last year, all of them white South Africans,
Yeah.
that tells you something about the changes we're living. So, on the one hand, yes, the support for Israel is melting and people are realizing what Israel is about. On the other hand, there were strong forces that tried to return us to a time of colonial domination and white pride and European pride. And so, and we shouldn't forget that the colonial past is very, very recent.
Yeah. I keep saying that the Europeans think of, or the general population in Europe thinks of colonialism the way they think of feudalism. They know it's part of their history. They know it was bad, but they think like, oh, it's long gone and we stopped that and we know that. But no, it's not. It's not. It continued straight into today. And now the interesting thing is, as you say, that there are forces, especially in the United States, with the speeches of Pete Hegseth, but also Donald Trump and, of course, Marco Rubio, who say like, no, we should be proud of our colonial past. And it is actually a shame that the beautiful colonial empires made way for this unruly jungle, as Josep Borrell would call it. So there is a real danger that good parts of North America and Europe will go back into a mentality of like, actually, we need to control it in order to make it beautiful, and we are under threat by this jungle from the outside, which is actually very akin to this Zionist ideology of being under threat by their immediate environment. So there is still a lot of compatibility, actually, in my view, between Zionism and European colonial dominance.
Well, it's quite obvious because Israel hosts conferences of right-wing movements in Europe.
Right.
And Israel is the example to follow for right-wing parties in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Hungary, because that's how you deal with these not quite white people. That's the real thing. Israel is admired. And you may have noticed that even those who tried to attack the Congress on the 6th of January after the election of Joe Biden, and they were unhappy about the loss of Trump, some of them went there with Israeli flags. Israel is the embodiment of the most right-wing, racist ideologies today. And you look at the friends that Israel has, and it tells you something about Israel. Again, it's important not to demonize the people, because I think that many Israelis are first and foremost victims of their own state. Mm-hmm. That's why you have quite a bit of exodus from Israel, not only because of the war and because of the difficulties of living under constant threat, but because many don't want to be part of it. And they prefer to live in normal countries where they don't have to be running to the shelters 3 times a day. I think that this message is being received in Israel, that all the previous wars were waged somewhere else. Of course, there were Israeli soldiers killed and families mourned and all that, but Israelis didn't run to shelters. There were no missiles falling on Israel, no serious missiles. There was kind of homemade Hamas missiles, but now you have sophisticated Iranian missiles that have fallen on Israel We still don't know because of censorship what exactly they did in Israel. But if people were running to the shelters 3 times a day, well, they must be doing something. So I think that there may be an awakening within Israel among part of the population that they may be better off in Brooklyn.
Right. Which would, of course, be a quite large threat to Zionism. Maybe just what can we do? Because there is this danger, of course, and you write about this also in your essay. Let me just show it again. I mean, you actually created a title called "Israel: A Danger to Jews and Non-Jews Alike?" question mark. And I think this as a question is, of course, very important. That the ways Israel and Zionism work, that they pose a threat not only to today's Jewish communities in the Arab world and abroad, but that maybe this will invite again violence against Jews, because people connect these things in a wrong way. You made that point. A lot of the Jews in Israel are actually the victims of their own state. What can we do in order to prevent, if the pendulum ever swings back, this fails association of all the Jews with the Zionist project?
Well, one thing we could do is to act in our own countries. I think we have greater impact on where we live.
Right.
And one issue is very important, is to explain that the state of Israel represents the state of Israel. It doesn't represent Jews.
Hmm.
And the Jews have always been divided as far as Zionism and Israel is concerned. And many Jews, particularly young Jews, are very active in anti-Zionist activities and criticizing Israel and so on. I explained some of it, since I've done a commercial for Israel National News. I feel free to do it for my own book, Israel and Palestine, which is a very short book that enables people to understand that it's totally wrong to associate Jews in their countries with Israel. They would say, well, but look at the Jewish institutions well, I don't have to go far. In Montreal, every Jewish institution, sort of official Jewish institution, has an Israeli flag in front of it, even an old age home. And there are consistent claims by the organized Jewish community, we stand by Israel now, and all that. What people don't see, because it's more hidden, is the role of Jews in denouncing Israel. Like Independent Jewish Voices, that I had the honor of being one of the founding members, does tremendous work in the press and media, but just among regular people, to realize that many Jews, particularly the so-called ultra-Orthodox Jews, the most visible Jews, in black and white attire, and therefore the most vulnerable. Because if someone associates Israel with Jews and say, well, I'm going to hurt the Jews for what they're doing to Palestinians, the easiest Jews to find would be those Jews, because they're identifiable, they're visible. You can't tell a Zionist from a non-Zionist. They look the same. But you can tell an ultra-Orthodox and a Haredi Jew very easily. So it's very important in our own countries to debunk the myth of Jew as an eternal victim, to fight against anti-Semitism, because one of the main purveyors of anti-Semitism is the state of Israel. And this is not something which is an accident, or, as they say in French, a concours de circonstances, that is circumstantial. Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, wrote very clearly in his diary, anti-Semites will be our most reliable friends, and anti-Semitic countries, most reliable allies.
It's so, the history is littered with ironies, but this one is not even a real one. It's a using of the of hate in the others in order to then accomplish your own goals that themselves have something to do with hate or spite for another group. It's a very sick sociological uh, um, ping pong that is going on here. I wonder how to break the chain in order to get away from it. But as you said, like we clarifying the concepts and clarifying what causes it is probably a major part of it.
It's very simple. On the 60th anniversary of Israel, I published an article in a German newspaper, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, on the lessons of Nazi genocide. And I said that there were two kinds of lessons that you can learn. One, you have to be very vigilant not to allow a democracy degenerate into a racist state, into an oppressive state. And you have to develop human rights and democratic rights in the country and protect them. That's one lesson. The other lesson is we were weak, we should be strong. They killed us because they wanted to have a pure German state, a pure Aryan state. We'll be strong and we'll create a pure Jewish state. And that's the lesson that the Zionists have learned. So there are two lessons which are obviously incompatible.
They are, and this is the learning the right lesson is always the most difficult thing from history. And I just want to point out again to everybody that you can find Yakov's essay here on my Substack, Israel, a Danger to Jews and Non-Jews Alike, and also this wonderful book that I also highly recommend, Zionism Decoded in 101 Quotes. We still work on a project on this. Stay tuned, there will be more to come. Yakov Rabkin, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for inviting me.